The sun was barely a pale shimmer above the jagged ridges when Caleb Danner stepped out onto the creaking porch of his lonely ranch house, the weight of another day heavy on his broad shoulders. It had been 2 years since his wife had passed, leaving the house far too quiet, the mornings far too long, and the land a little less worth living for, but the work never stopped. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and the dust storms didn't care how hollow a man felt inside. He'd recently taken in a new cook, a quiet young woman named Mary Fletcher who'd shown up in town with no luggage except a dented kettle and a look in her eyes that said she didn't expect to be treated kindly, but Caleb, knowing what it felt like to be swallowed by grief, hired her without question. She kept mostly to herself, cooking hearty meals and scrubbing the kitchen spotless, yet something about her didn't sit right with him. Not her cooking, which was as fine as any he'd tasted, but the way she seemed to flinch whenever someone walked behind her, the way she kept her sleeves pulled down even when the heat was unbearable, the way her eyes darted to the door as if measuring the distance in case she had to run. One evening, as he brought in a crate of supplies, he caught sight of her rolling up her sleeves at the sink, and his stomach clenched. Dark bruises ringed her wrists, angry and fresh, and when she noticed his gaze, she yanked the fabric down like she'd been burned. "Mary," he said gently, "who did that to you?" But she shook her head, muttering something about an accident, her voice brittle as old wood. Caleb had spent enough years breaking horses to know the difference between an accident and cruelty. Those marks told a story, and it wasn't one she was ready to share. He didn't push her, not that night, but his mind churned long after the lamps were blown out. A week later, the truth came riding in on a black horse, wearing a sheriff's star and a smirk as mean as a rattlesnake's glare. Sheriff Lang, a man whose authority stretched wider than his moral compass, rode straight up to Caleb's porch and called for Mary to come out. She froze in the kitchen doorway, her hands trembling, and Caleb saw a fear in her eyes that made his blood boil. "She's wanted back in town," Lang said, his voice oozing with false authority. "Property dispute gone bad, she's mine to take." But Caleb had seen enough men like Lang in his time, men who used power as a weapon, and something in him snapped. "She's not yours to take," Caleb said, stepping between them, his voice low and steady. Lang dismounted slowly, swaggering closer, letting his hand rest on the butt of his revolver. "Don't get in my way, Danner. She belongs to me." Those words made Caleb's vision narrow to a tunnel. He didn't know the whole story yet, but he knew enough. No woman belonged to any man. He moved so fast that Lang barely saw it coming. One moment the sheriff's hand was on his gun, the next he was flat on his back in the dust with Caleb's boot on his chest. "You come back for her," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm, "and you'll leave in a box." Lang spat dust and hate, but he knew better than to draw on a man like Caleb with half the town already peering out from behind their curtains. He mounted up and rode away, but Caleb knew men like him didn't forgive, and they didn't forget. That night, Mary finally spoke, haltingly, between tears, about how she'd been working as a seamstress in town until Lang took a liking to her, hiring her to cook and clean his house, paying her in insults and blows, locking her in when she tried to leave. The property dispute was a lie she'd only ever been trying to escape. Caleb listened without interrupting, letting her see in his eyes that he believed her, that she was safe here. But safety in the West was always temporary, and sure enough, 2 nights later, Lang returned with 3 deputies, their rifles gleaming in the moonlight. Caleb was waiting. He'd seen the signs, heard the riders in the distance, and he'd made up his mind. If they wanted Mary, they'd have to go through him. What followed was the kind of standoff folks in town would talk about for years. 4 men against 1, but the one had the high ground, a steady aim, and the kind of fury that made his trigger finger unshakable. Caleb's warning shot tore a plank clean off the hitching post, sending Lang's men diving for cover, and for a tense, breathless minute, no one moved. Then the townsfolk began to appear, first one, then another, stepping out of the shadows with rifles of their own. Neighbors who'd heard enough of Lang's abuse and decided they weren't going to let the law be twisted into a weapon anymore. Outnumbered now, Lang spat one last curse, mounted up, and rode off into the dark for good. In the weeks that followed, Mary's bruises faded, though the shadows in her eyes took longer to heal. She stayed on at the ranch, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to, because she'd found a place where her worth wasn't measured by how much pain she could endure. Caleb never asked her to repay him, never demanded anything but her trust, and slowly, she gave it. Folks said Caleb Danner's stand against the sheriff was the moment the whole town found its backbone, and though he shrugged off the talk, he noticed the way Mary smiled now without looking over her shoulder. Out here in the West, where the law was often just a man with a gun and the truth was whatever the loudest voice said it was, it took real grit to stand up for what was right. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, of courage, loyalty, and the kind of justice you can't buy, then hit that subscribe button right now, because we've got plenty more to tell.